Hello and thanks for having us this evening. Today what I really want to discuss is looking really beyond the p-value. When we look at research, or you've probably picked up research and you've looked at straight away to the abstract and became what I tell my students not to be, is the abstract author. We've all probably done that in time, whether that's in our academic journeys or whether it's been in the journey of a practitioner. You may still do that, and it's not necessarily a bad thing as such, in terms of you may not have that scientific knowledge or the analytical skills to then go and further investigate what has been purported in that particular bit of research, so that we can ultimately interpret the research in its correct fashion and applied in the correct manner. And we do have a particular field now that is looking at the applied research side of things and its application into applied science. And there's a little bit of a gap or a bridge there, so hopefully by the end of this, we have a few more skills there that we can apply and ultimately bridge that gap and close that and cross that bridge. So generally speaking, in sports science, we tend to work at a 95% probability level. And when we look at the more clinical medical side of things, and in some aspects of sports science as well, we then work towards a 99% probability level. And we do that in order to eliminate type 1 and type 2 errors. What can happen is while we try and lower one, we can ultimately enhance the other. So that's something that we have to take into consideration with research. Ultimately, we can't have 100% probability level, because that is initially saying, or we are interpreting straight away, that one thing ultimately affects another thing. And we have to delve a little bit further than that in order to draw up the right conclusions. One of the things that we ultimately look at straight away is the research-led or the problem-led question, and that is exactly what it is. It's a problem-led question. We are looking to see if there's a cause and effect between one variable or things that we manipulate, which would be the independent variable, on the dependent variable, which is a measurement or something we take from our subjects or participants within the study. And while we're looking at that's another thing we have to think of. So I'll use a particular, particularly something that we all know, heavily researched. In fact, probably one of the most heavily researched supplements there is, and we look at creatine monohydrate, and we can look at something like the effects of creatine monohydrate on body composition in resistance trained females, which is one of a bit of research that I've been involved in. And we look there, and straight away we have to look at how many participants we had within that study in order to then resemble some form of statistical power. So if we then look and we see that we have 8 subjects, can we really draw a sound scientific conclusion from that with just 8 people, as opposed to if we had 80 and we have or even more? We have to then look at the practicality of subject recruitment in order to then take those conclusions and move them forward. I'm not necessarily saying that bit of research would be bad. That's not what I'm saying, because you might find in the recommendations that in order to enhance the research, we have to have a larger participant base to draw those conclusions from. We have to then look at as well resistance trained females. Is it that the menstrual cycle could have a significant part of that? And the answer to that would definitely be yes. I mean, obviously we have a very different endocrine response from a female as they progress through that cycle at various stages, as opposed to a male who wouldn't go through those particular endocrine or sudden endocrine changes through particular phases of a menstrual cycle. We would then have to look at as well some of the the wider ranging variables, and if we stick with that particular bit of research that I'm discussing, we then have to look at the nutritional status of the participants or the subjects. I mean, we know that someone who maybe is a vegetarian or vegan would respond greater, or would have less intramuscular storage than someone that eats meat. So we have to take that into consideration as well, the response rate, which then could ultimately, we look at non-response rate. We do know that people don't respond to particular supplementation or nutrients, and if that's the case, has the researcher, included that, or have they highlighted the non-response rate? Now, I mean, to find that would be particularly difficult, because the way we would do that would be through muscle biopsy, and not many people are going to let you open up the leg and take a muscle biopsy, especially not athletes. That isn't going to happen. So we have to take that into consideration as well. Further to that, we really need to look at as well, and a good example is the actual purported mechanism of action, and a good example of that would be B-alanine. I have seen in practice where some people have taken a piece of research when it's been purported to work, and we know that in some cases B-alanine works, but we have to then consider what the research is telling us it works in, and we can't just take the blanket approach and oppose it to somewhere else. So we have to consider that as well. But again, when we look at who this research has been done on, can we then generalize that? We're looking at resistance trained females. Does that mean we can then take that and put that into male hockey players? Does that mean we can take that and put that into female basketball players? Maybe it's not. There's obviously warrant there for more investigation, and I'm just using this particular bit of research as an example. You may find research that supports that as well, but in its general approach, we can't just assume that. We have to then investigate and make sure that that is the case. Okay, because we look at the biomechanical movements of each sport, and it's very different. The physiological responses and the endocrine responses to the particular exercise stimuli that's happening within those sports is very different. So we can't just interpret that particular value from that bit of research and then take it and apply it across board. We can't do that. We have to then also look at the overarching strategy, and we have to look and think, does that sit with the problem-led question? Ultimately, the design and the data collection methods as well will sit within that strategy. We have to look at the design of the research itself and the data collection in terms of how was the data collected. Was it the gold standard way of collecting that? And in some cases, there may not be accessibility, or it may be too costly to use the gold standard approach. So a researcher will then make an informed decision around what could possibly be deemed as the next best way of capturing that particular data, and that's something that has to be looked into and also considered when we're trying to interpret the data, interpret the research and apply that into the field as well. So that's another aspect we have to then think about. We also need to think about when we think about the design, and we think about the framework in which it's been collected and administered. We then have to think about the descriptive nature of the particular data that's been collected, and we do that by running some form of descriptives, because we can have a large data set, it might range from, one side being, i.e. 1 right up to say 100. We have to have a descriptive form of that before we take that into inferentials, and we then look at the standard deviation, and we need to look at the normative data and see if there's any skewness, run some tests on that, and ultimately that could particularly impact research, especially if we have some form of outliers. And again, like we refer back to, an outlier could be one of those non-responders. We also have to think about how or what it is we are actually trying to engage from that research into the practice. Okay, and we have to think about that very carefully in order to then draw off conclusions that would sit in a very, or what we would hope would be an ethical and robust manner. So I think there's a few things that really we need to think about when we come to engaging with research and interpreting what it is that has been found, or what's been purported to be found. And really we have to do that via a multitude of avenues, and thinking very much in a critical mindset. And what we have to think is, how was it done? Could it have been done better? If so, how could it have been done better? That's what we have to ultimately think when we are engaging with that piece of research. But we also have to have that level of practicality as well. So it may be that the data was collected one way, but it was for a very valid reason. We have to consider that when we're engaging with the research. Another thing, when we're discussing that particular bit of research that I was involved in, and we have to consider is, when we're talking about supplementation as well, we really need to think about the levels or the timing of the supplementation. So in this case, we look at creatine, how much creatine was administered. When was it administered? We know now, or we're certainly finding that there could be a mechanism behind positive or more enhanced ergogenic effects of creatine post-training as opposed to pre-training. Something that is being investigated in order to see where that's going. So ultimately that could have an impact. We know around dosage protocols, and we have to then consider that. We have to look at as well some of the techniques or the interventions that were put in place. So if we think about the resistance training side of things, how was that administered? People maybe don't have time, or certainly it isn't practical for all your subjects to come in, and in an ideal world we have them run through the intervention with an S&C coach, so we know it's been done, and we have them taking the creatine supervised. That may not be practical, so what happens is it becomes self-administered, and we understand that the issues that surround self-administration. Someone might have not taken creatine one day and then decided, well, I'll take 10 grams today. They might not have took it for 3 days. When they're doing the exercises, they may think they've done the exercise right, but they haven't done the exercise right. It's all something that needs to be considered with a degree of certainty of knowing that there could well be some mistakes made on the self-administration side. So we certainly have to look into that aspect and make sure that we are looking way beyond just that alpha value in order to really engage with the piece of research in question, and make sure that we're applying it in its right context, because ultimately it happens quite regularly, and it can then have, or it can lose its ergogenic properties because of that. And obviously, I appreciate there's a lot more that goes into that. But I realise we're on a time scale, and I do know that you've got some other people that are coming on to talk to you tonight that are far more interesting than what I am, and can offer you a little bit probably more insight into the vocational side of things. I just really wanted to give you some or one or two things that to really think about the next time you're picking up a piece of research, in order to then enhance your practice, or try and establish a way of ultimately improving an athletic performance or a body composition or even just general health. But one thing that I would really say, and it is very paramount, is that we are all chasing that 1%. Ultimately, what can happen is, though, we can lose by 100%, because if we get the interpretation wrong and we don't understand where that particular result or where that particular practical guideline has come from, we could actually cause 100% failure. Because if an athlete stops, then that is ultimately 100% 100% lost, failed, as opposed to that 1% gain. So we have to be very cute about how we chase that 1%. And I think one of these, I think one of the main or critical junctions for me is that interpretation of scientific